She was sold for wearing pants, until a cowboy said, "With me, she chooses in a remote village nestled between rolling hills and dusty paths in northern Pakistan. Life moved slowly. The sun rose over the small mud-brick homes, casting a golden light on the narrow streets, and the sound of roosters crowing mingled with the low bleating of goats. Among these winding alleys and simple homes lived Amina, a young woman of 22, whose eyes held both curiosity and quiet determination. She moved with a gentle grace, tending to the chores of her modest home, yet in her heart, she carried dreams that extended far beyond the boundaries of the village. Amina had grown up in a world where tradition shaped every choice. Her family, like many others in the village, followed strict customs. Girls were expected to wear long dresses and head coverings, speak softly, and always defer to their elders. But Amina had a quiet defiance that set her apart. She had always been drawn to freedom in small ways. A different path through the fields, a secret storybook under the shade of a tree, or most daringly, the trousers she wore in the privacy of her room. Pants, comfortable and practical, allowed her to move easily through the rocky terrain and climb the old trees that dotted the village edges. She knew that in the eyes of her community, even such a small act could be seen as rebellious, but the sensation of autonomy made her heart swell with a joy she could not deny. Her parents, particularly her mother, were gentle but cautious. They loved Amina dearly and often warned her about the risks of straying too far from tradition. Her father, a farmer with a stern yet fair disposition, worked long hours in the fields, providing for the family while ensuring that Amina and her younger siblings respected the customs that had governed the village for generations. Despite this, her mother sometimes found her secretly wearing pants, her nimble hands adjusting the waistband or smoothing the fabric as she tiptoed through the house. Amina's mother would sigh softly, a mixture of worry and amusement, recognizing the spark of independence in her daughter. Amina's life was full of small joys. She cherished the early mornings when the village was quiet, and the birds sang a melody that seemed to promise more than the day could contain. She loved wandering to the nearby stream, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and she would watch the sunlight dancing on the ripples. Here, she could think freely away from the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors. Books were her secret companions. She had discovered an old, tattered copy of stories from far-off lands hidden under her uncle's shelf, and reading them became a sacred ritual. Through these pages, she imagined cities with bustling streets, endless skies, and women who could walk freely without fear or judgment. But life in the village was never truly private. The walls were thin, and the eyes of neighbors seemed always to watch, waiting to see who would follow the rules and who might step out of line. It was not that the villagers were cruel. They were bound by their own histories, by the weight of generations of customs, and by the belief that order and morality depended on everyone adhering to the same standards. Even small deviations could become scandalous if noticed. One warm afternoon, Amina ventured to the village market to fetch supplies for her mother. The sun hung high in the sky, and the heat made the dirt road shimmer in the distance. She wore her favorite pants today, the ones she had carefully stitched herself from a piece of sturdy cloth she had saved for months. As she walked past the stalls of spices, woven fabrics, and fresh vegetables, she felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. It was a simple choice for her, comfortable clothing to move freely, but in the eyes of others it was a bold statement. She noticed a group of women gathering near the market fountain, their heads bent in hushed conversation. As Amina approached, a few of them glanced her way. Their eyes lingered on her trousers, their whispers rising just enough for her to catch snippets. "Have you seen what she is wearing?" one murmured. "Does she not respect our customs?" A cold chill ran down her spine, and for a moment she wished she could disappear into the dusty road. But she also felt a tiny thrill. This small act of wearing pants had already begun to ripple through the village. By the evening, the whispers had reached her family. Her father's face was drawn and tense, and her mother avoided looking directly at her. The weight of expectation pressed down heavily on Amina, and she realized that her simple act of choosing her clothing had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. The village council, a group of respected elders, was known to intervene in matters of morality, and it seemed that her choice had caught their attention. The next day, men came to her home, their expressions stern and unyielding. Amina's heart raced as she listened to their words, words that spoke of dishonor and punishment, of rules that must be enforced to preserve the fabric of their community. Her father tried to reason with them, explaining that Amina meant no harm, that she was a good girl who respected her family in every other way. But the elders were firm, their minds unbending. Tradition, they said, demanded correction, and in their eyes, Amina's trousers were more than clothing. They were a challenge to the order of the village itself. The punishment was announced. Amina would be sold into marriage to a distant relative. The words struck her like a blow. She had heard of families arranging marriages, but the idea of being treated as property was almost unimaginable. Her mind spun with fear and disbelief. She tried to protest, her voice trembling, but it seemed small against the weight of centuries-old customs. Her mother clutched her hand, tears streaking her cheeks, and whispered that she must endure, that resistance could bring more harm than relief. Days passed in a blur of preparation and quiet sorrow. Amina's belongings were packed into a small bundle, each item a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. The sun seemed harsher, the winds colder, and even the birds' songs sounded like warnings. She lingered by the stream one last time, watching the water slip over the stones, feeling the freedom of choice she had once taken for granted slipping from her hands. She whispered to herself that she would not forget these moments, that she would carry them inside her, even when her life felt entirely controlled by others. The journey to her new home was long and filled with uncertainty. She traveled with the family she was to join, silent and withdrawn, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if it might offer an escape. Every passing village, every curious glance from strangers reminded her of the life she had lost. Yet even in her despair, there was a tiny flicker of hope. Somewhere beyond the confines of tradition, perhaps life could be different. Perhaps she could find moments where she could reclaim even a fragment of freedom. When they finally arrived at the home of her future husband, the reality of her situation became even clearer. The house was large and imposing, a far cry from her modest family home. Its walls seemed to echo with the expectations of everyone who had come before her. She was no longer Amina, a young woman with small rebellions and secret joys. She was now a possession, an object of agreement between families, and her desires and choices mattered little. Amina spent her first night in the new home in quiet reflection. She stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks with her eyes, trying to imagine a life that could still belong to her. She thought of her mother's gentle face, of the stream where sunlight had danced on the water, of the books she had cherished in secret. These memories became her companions, a fragile shield against the despair that threatened to engulf her. Even in the grip of fear and uncertainty, Amina's mind remained alert, her spirit quietly resilient. She understood that the path ahead would be difficult, filled with rules and restrictions designed to suppress her individuality. But deep within her, a small, persistent flame burned, a desire for choice, for autonomy, for life lived on her own terms. This flame, though fragile, was the seed of what would later grow into courage. In the village, life continued around her as if nothing had changed. The elders returned to their daily routines, neighbors whispered and watched, and the rhythm of the hills and fields carried on. Yet for Amina, everything had changed. The world she had known, the world where she could climb trees, read books, and wear pants in secret, had narrowed into a confined space defined by others' rules. And yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, she held on to the belief that one day she might walk freely again, not as someone who had been sold, but as someone who had chosen her own path. The first weeks in her new home were a harsh awakening for Amina. The house, though large, was cold and unfamiliar, its walls echoing with rules she had never learned but was expected to follow. Every room felt like a cage, every hallway a reminder that she no longer moved freely. Her new family treated her with polite distance, and at times with quiet suspicion. Even the smallest gestures of independence, like choosing when to fetch water or when to tend the small vegetable garden, were met with curt instructions or sharp eyes. Amina felt invisible yet constantly observed, as though her every thought had been catalogued and judged before she had even spoken. Mornings were the hardest. She would wake to the clatter of pots and the smell of bread baking in the communal oven. Her husband, a man several years older and quiet by nature, rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was in short, clipped sentences. At first, Amina tried to learn his patterns, hoping that by reading his moods, she might find a corner of peace in this new life. But the truth was relentless. Her voice mattered little, her choices were insignificant, and the world she had once known, where she could wander, climb trees, and read under the sun, had vanished. Even so, Amina refused to let despair fully consume her. She found solace in small routines, tending to the garden, sweeping the courtyards, and carefully observing the patterns of the birds that perched on the windowsills. These small acts became her lifelines, little fragments of control she could cling to. At night, when the household was quiet, she would sit by the window, tracing the silhouette of distant hills, letting her mind wander back to the days she had worn pants in secret and felt the wind on her legs as she climbed the trees. Those memories were her secret rebellion, tiny sparks of freedom that no one could take away. One late afternoon, while she carried a bucket of water toward the animals, Amina noticed a figure on the outskirts of the village. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, was walking alongside a small herd of cattle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes and leather boots that had clearly seen long journeys. His movements were easy, confident, and his presence commanded attention without a word. Amina froze for a moment, curious yet cautious. He seemed out of place, as if he belonged to another world entirely. The man noticed her gaze and gave a slight nod. Amina's heart skipped. She looked away quickly, but she could not ignore the feeling of being seen, not in judgment, but in recognition. She returned to her chores, but the image of him lingered in her mind. Over the next several days, she began to notice him more often. Sometimes he would appear near the stream, sometimes on a path that wound past her household. Each time their eyes met briefly, and each time Amina felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Eventually, the man approached her cautiously. "Hello," he said, his voice warm and gentle, carrying a sound unfamiliar in her village. "I'm Jack. I just moved here to start a ranch." His accent was different, but his words were easy to understand. Amina's first instinct was to retreat, to hide behind the walls she had been forced to live within. But something about the way he spoke, calm, respectful, patient, made her pause. Over time, Jack's visits became more frequent. He never imposed, never asked too many questions, and never lingered inappropriately. Instead, he spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the animals, the landscape. He seemed to notice the small details, the way the sunlight caught the hills, the way the trees swayed in the wind, and even the faint traces of sadness in Amina's eyes. His presence became a small, unexpected relief from the suffocating routine of her new life. Amina began to talk to him in small ways, cautiously at first. She would comment on the weather or the appearance of a new flower in the garden. Jack listened intently, nodding and smiling in a way that made her feel like her words mattered. Slowly, she began to share more. Little stories about the village, memories of her family, and even, cautiously, the books she loved to read. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of connection, a reminder that the world was bigger than the walls she was confined within. But the village was never far from her thoughts, and she was constantly aware of the risk. If anyone discovered her conversations with Jack, the consequences could be severe. The elders were quick to enforce the rules, and her family's honor rested heavily on her compliance. Rumors spread easily, and she could see the judgmental glances of neighbors when she passed through the streets. Still, she could not deny the relief and joy she felt when she saw Jack's friendly smile, the way he treated her as a person, not as an object to be owned. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Amina and Jack found themselves near the stream. The water ran cool and clear, and the air was quiet except for the occasional bird call. For the first time, Amina allowed herself to speak freely, to share her feelings without fear of immediate judgment. She spoke of the unfairness of being treated as property, of the isolation she had felt in her new home, and of the longing she carried for a life she could call her own. Jack listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded slowly, his expression serious but kind. "You should never have to live like that," he said. "Everyone deserves to make their own choices, to live freely. No one should decide your life for you." His words were simple, but they carried a weight she had not heard in years. For a moment, Amina allowed herself to believe that perhaps there was a life beyond the strict rules and harsh expectations, a life where she could choose for herself. Days turned into weeks, and Amina began to notice subtle changes in herself. The fear that had clung to her like a heavy cloak began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of empowerment. She still followed the rules at home, still navigated the careful balance required to avoid conflict, but inside she felt a flicker of hope. She realized that even in the strictest environments, small acts of courage, small connections, small moments of self-expression could sustain a person's spirit. Yet the threat of discovery always lingered. Villagers were observant, and the elder's eyes seemed to follow her movements even when she was alone. Amina knew that she could not fully escape the weight of tradition, and she feared the consequences if her growing bond with Jack were discovered. She began to learn the careful art of discretion, how to speak in whispers, how to meet without attracting attention, how to carry her small rebellions quietly without endangering herself. Jack, too, seemed aware of the delicate situation. He never pushed, never demanded, and never suggested that she defy her family openly. Instead, he offered patience and understanding, waiting for her to find her own strength. His presence became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that even in a world that sought to confine her, there were people who recognized her humanity and her right to choose. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of a large oak tree at the edge of the village, Amina finally admitted the fear that had been gnawing at her. "I don't know if I can ever be free," she said quietly, her hands twisting in her lap. "The village, my family, everything expects me to obey. I feel trapped." Jack reached out, placing a reassuring hand near hers, though he did not touch it. "Freedom doesn't always come all at once," he said gently. "Sometimes it comes slowly in moments like these. You have a choice in small things, and one day those choices can grow. You don't have to face it alone." For the first time in weeks, Amina felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen just a little. She realized that even if the path ahead was difficult, she was not entirely powerless. There were allies, however few, and there were moments of joy that could be seized, even in a world that sought to suppress her spirit. As the days passed, Amina and Jack continued to meet discreetly, sharing stories, learning from one another, and building a quiet trust. She discovered that his life had been full of hard work, adventure, and learning to live by his own rules. His presence was a gentle rebellion against the harshness of her circumstances, and she found herself dreaming, cautiously, of what life could be if she were allowed to choose her own path. Though the danger of being discovered remained, Amina began to reclaim small parts of herself. She walked more confidently, spoke with more certainty, and allowed herself the quiet joy of planning for a future she might one day control. The connection with Jack became a lifeline, a reminder that human kindness and respect could exist even in the most restrictive environments. In the heart of the village, among the dusty roads and watchful eyes, Amina began to feel something she had not experienced in months: hope. It was fragile, like the first green shoots of spring after a long winter, but it existed. And with hope came courage, and with courage, the beginnings of freedom. Even as her days remained constrained by tradition and expectation, Amina understood that a different life was possible. She could imagine a future where she would not simply follow orders, where she could move, speak, and live according to her own choices. It was this thought, quiet but persistent, that carried her through each difficult day, preparing her for the challenges and decisions that lay ahead. The days grew hotter as summer approached, and the tension in Amina's life became heavier with each passing sunrise. Her routine remained the same, yet every action felt charged with anxiety. The village seemed smaller than ever, the walls of her new home tighter, and the whispers of neighbors louder in her ears. Despite the warmth of Jack's friendship, the village itself pressed down on her with invisible hands. Even a brief smile from him in the market or near the stream felt like an act of rebellion, and she feared that someone would see, that someone would report, and that the weight of punishment would fall upon her once again. One afternoon, as she was carrying water to the animals, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the well. Curiosity drew her closer, and then dread took over. The village elders, men whose words could shape the lives of many, were present. Their eyes, stern and unwavering, scanned the crowd and lingered momentarily on her. A cold shiver ran through her body. Whispers reached her ears, words she had tried not to hear. "It seems she spends far too much time near that foreign man," someone muttered. "Perhaps she forgets her place." Her heart raced. She had tried to keep her interactions with Jack private, yet it seemed that her every movement was being watched. Fear clawed at her chest as she quickly completed her chores. the water sloshing in the bucket making a rhythm that matched her pulse. For the first time since arriving at this home, she felt a sharp sting of vulnerability, realizing just how powerless she could be in the eyes of tradition. Over the next days, the tension escalated. Her family became more strict, their instructions sharper, their eyes following her everywhere. Even simple tasks felt like tests, and any misstep could lead to humiliation or punishment. Amina's husband remained distant, but she could sense the unease in his quiet glances. The village seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how she would respond to their expectations. Jack, sensing her growing anxiety, began to visit more cautiously. He no longer spoke freely in public places, but waited for moments when they could meet discreetly under the shade of the trees on the outskirts of the village. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, he arrived with a calm, reassuring smile. "Don't let them crush your spirit," he said gently. "You have a voice, you have choices even when it feels like you don't. You just have to find the courage to use them." Amina nodded, swallowing hard. The words filled her with warmth, yet a part of her remained terrified. Courage, she realized, was not simply an absence of fear. It was a decision to act even when the fear was strong. And acting meant confronting not only the village but her own family, a step that could bring anger, shame, or worse. The breaking point arrived quietly, as most life-changing moments do, not with a shout, but with a single spark that sets a larger fire. Amina was helping in the courtyard when one of the elder women of the village approached her mother. Their voices were low but sharp, carrying a weight that made Amina's stomach churn. She could hear phrases like improper conduct and dishonor brought to the family, words that seemed small but carried centuries of judgment. Amina felt her heart tighten. Her mother's face was pale, her lips pressed together as though holding back words she could not say. Amina realized that this time the pressure was no longer subtle. The whispers and glances had become demands. The village wanted her to conform, and they would not rest until she obeyed. Fear rose in her throat, yet beneath it, something else, something stronger, began to awaken. That night Amina could not sleep. She lay on the hard mattress, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every word, every glance that had reminded her she was not free. She thought of Jack, of his gentle encouragement, of the moments when he had reminded her that she had the right to choose her own path. And in that quiet darkness, she made a decision. She would no longer allow fear to dictate her life. If tradition wanted to suppress her spirit, she would not give it the satisfaction. The next morning, she acted with a resolve that surprised even herself. When her mother gave her instructions, she followed them, but with a clarity and calm that was new. When her father offered advice, she listened, but her eyes held a quiet determination that spoke louder than words. Even her husband noticed the change, sensing a fire that had not been there before. Amina felt the weight of the village's expectations but refused to let it crush her. Her opportunity to assert herself arrived sooner than expected. Jack had come to the outskirts of the village once again, and as Amina approached, she noticed several villagers observing from a distance. Fear rose immediately, but she forced herself to stay calm. Jack greeted her with a small nod, and she nodded back, acknowledging him without panic. Then she made a choice, one small, deliberate act that was more powerful than any shouting could be. She spoke. Her voice, though quiet, carried a strength she had not known she possessed. "I will not live as property," she said. The words trembled at first, but as she continued, they gained confidence. "I will make my own choices. I am a person, not an object to be traded. My life is mine." The villagers froze, some gasped, others whispered. A few of the elders' faces tightened in anger, but Amina no longer felt fear. She saw Jack standing beside her, calm, steady, offering silent support. And in that moment, the impossible seemed real. She was claiming her voice in a world that had long told her it did not exist. The confrontation that followed was tense but not violent. The elders spoke in measured tones, reminding her of the traditions and expectations she was meant to follow. But Amina remained firm. She spoke of fairness, of freedom, of the need for respect, not control. She did not shout, she did not cry, she did not plead. She simply stated the truth as clearly as she could. She had the right to choose her own life. Her family, at first shocked, began to understand the depth of her determination. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but of pride. Her father remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Amina could sense a shift. Her husband, too, looked at her differently, a quiet acknowledgement that the woman before him was no longer someone to be commanded, but someone with her own will. The village, of course, was divided. Some admired her courage quietly, while others muttered that she had gone too far. But for Amina, the fear that had once consumed her was replaced with a sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. Tradition would not yield easily, and she would face scrutiny and challenge for years to come. But she had taken the first and most important step. She had reclaimed her voice. Jack, who had watched silently through it all, finally spoke, his voice warm and steady. "With me you choose," he said simply. The words, though few, carried a weight that made Amina's chest lift. For the first time since arriving in this restrictive household, she felt a profound sense of freedom, not a complete escape, but a beginning. In the following days, Amina's life began to change in subtle but important ways. She continued to perform her duties, but with a sense of self-respect and quiet authority. She no longer moved as if invisible, but with awareness that her actions, though constrained, were hers to direct. She continued to meet Jack in discreet locations, sharing stories, laughter, and hopes for a future that seemed increasingly possible. Even the villagers began to notice. While many still whispered, others watched in awe as Amina carried herself with a newfound dignity. They saw that her courage had not led to chaos or disrespect, but to a calm, quiet strength that made her presence undeniable. Some began to question their assumptions about control, obedience, and the role of women in their tightly bound society. Amina herself was transformed. The fear that had once defined her days was replaced with resilience. She learned to navigate the delicate balance of respect and assertion, of tradition and personal freedom. She realized that courage was not a single act, but a series of choices, small, deliberate, and sometimes quiet. She understood that change would not come overnight, but that each step she took, each boundary she gently challenged, was a victory in itself. By the time the summer began to wane, Amina had become a quiet symbol of resistance. She was still within the walls of her new home, still under the watchful eyes of the village, but her spirit was no longer confined. She had spoken her truth, and even if others did not fully approve, they could not erase the presence of a woman who had reclaimed her voice and her right to choose. And so, Amina waited, patient but determined, knowing that the journey ahead would continue to test her. But she was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold for wearing pants. She was a young woman who had faced fear, spoken truth, and taken the first steps toward freedom. And with Jack by her side, she knew that the possibility of a life where she could make her own choices was no longer a distant dream. It was slowly becoming reality. Amina woke to a calm morning, the first in weeks where she felt more in control than constrained. The sunlight streamed through the small window of her room, casting warm patterns on the earthen floor. The familiar sounds of the village, the low bleating of goats, the distant crow of a rooster, still reached her ears, but today they seemed different. They no longer carried the weight of judgment. Instead, they were ordinary sounds in a world she was slowly learning to navigate with courage. Since confronting the village elders, life had changed in ways both small and profound. Her family still lived within the rhythms of tradition, but the tension that had weighed so heavily on them had eased. Her mother's eyes, once clouded with worry, now reflected pride and relief. Her father, quiet and cautious as ever, offered her subtle signs of respect, a nod or a slight smile, acknowledging the strength she had shown. Even her husband, while still reserved, treated her with a newfound calm, as though silently recognizing that she was no longer someone who could be commanded without consideration. Yet freedom, she knew, was not something that could be declared with a single statement. It came slowly, in careful steps, in the accumulation of small choices that shaped a life over time. Amina had begun to claim those moments, walking in the garden at dawn, choosing the books she wanted to read, speaking her mind quietly but firmly when instructions or demands felt unfair. Each act, however small, was a victory in itself, a reaffirmation that she could make decisions for herself. Jack continued to be a steady presence in her life. He visited in ways that respected the delicate balance she needed to maintain. Often they would meet under the large oak tree at the edge of the village, where the branches formed a natural canopy, shielding them from prying eyes. They spoke of simple things, plans for the ranch, the changing seasons, the animals that needed care. but also of dreams, hopes, and possibilities that stretched far beyond the hills surrounding the village. Jack listened as she shared stories of her childhood, of the books she had read, and of the small joys she had once taken for granted. And sometimes he offered advice, gently reminding her that courage was not only about standing up to others, but also about nurturing herself in the quiet moments of life. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, Jack suggested a walk beyond the village. "There is a path through the hills," he said, "where no one will watch us. I want to show you something." Amina hesitated for only a moment, then agreed, sensing that this journey was more than a walk. It was a step toward claiming space for herself in a world that had tried to confine her. The path was narrow and winding, bordered by wildflowers and shrubs that swayed gently in the breeze. As they walked, the sounds of the village faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Amina felt a lightness in her chest she had not known in months. The hills stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time she imagined a life that was hers to shape, a life where the expectations of others could not define her. At the top of the hill, the view opened into a wide valley, green and alive with sunlight. Jack gestured toward the horizon. "This is what I wanted you to see," he said. "A place where you can imagine your own life, not someone else's rules, not someone else's judgment, just you." Amina's eyes filled with tears as she looked over the valley. It was more than beauty, it was possibility. For the first time, she felt that the future could belong to her. The journey down the hill was quiet, each step deliberate. Amina realized that courage and choice were not fleeting. They were built through persistence, through small decisions repeated over time. She understood that the village might still resist, that whispers would continue, and that her family might still struggle with change. But she also knew that she had discovered a power that could not be taken away, the ability to make choices for herself. Over the following weeks, Amina began to take more deliberate steps toward autonomy. She learned to negotiate her responsibilities at home, balancing tradition with her need for freedom. She spent more time with Jack, not in secret acts of rebellion, but in shared experiences that respected her situation while nurturing her independence. They worked together to care for the small herd of cattle and the garden, sharing tasks and learning from each other's skills. Amina discovered joy in these moments, not only in the companionship, but also in the knowledge that she was contributing on her own terms. Her reputation in the village slowly began to shift. While some still disapproved, others began to observe the changes with quiet admiration. They noticed her confidence, the calm way she spoke, and the respect she now commanded, not through defiance but through steady self-assurance. Mothers began to whisper to their daughters about the young woman who had reclaimed her voice, a subtle example that courage could exist alongside respect for tradition. Even the elders, while cautious, began to recognize that Amina's choices did not bring chaos, only a quiet strength that could not be ignored. One morning, Amina made a decision that symbolized the full reclaiming of her autonomy. She returned to her childhood books, long hidden under her uncle's old shelf, and began to read aloud to the children of the village. At first, they gathered hesitantly, curious about her stories. Soon, their laughter and questions filled the air, and the adults watched in quiet amazement. Amina realized that by sharing knowledge and joy, she was not only asserting her own independence, but also inspiring others to imagine possibilities beyond the restrictions they had always known. Jack was there, as always, smiling quietly. "You've grown stronger than you realize," he said one afternoon as they watched the children run across the courtyard, books clutched in their hands. "You've taken fear and turned it into something beautiful." That's true courage. Amina felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of accomplishment that had little to do with defiance and everything to do with self-respect and the careful nurturing of her own spirit. The seasons changed, and with them, Amina's life took on a rhythm of possibility. She continued her daily tasks, but each was now framed by her ability to choose, to prioritize, to act with intention. She wore clothing that felt comfortable, balanced with respect for her family and community. She explored ideas she had never been allowed to consider, dreaming quietly of a life that could extend beyond the village. And she loved knowing that, with Jack by her side, she had someone who respected her choices, someone who offered support without control. Amina's transformation became evident to all who knew her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her eyes steady and her words measured. People began to seek her advice, to notice her insights and intelligence. The same village that had once whispered in judgment now looked on with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Her presence challenged assumptions without confrontation, showing that change could exist peacefully through the quiet strength of one determined individual. By the time autumn arrived, Amina's life had shifted in ways she had only dreamed of. She was no longer defined by fear or by the expectations of others. She had claimed her voice, her choices, and her sense of self. She continued to honor her family and traditions where possible, but she no longer sacrificed her autonomy to appease the judgments of the village. She had discovered that true freedom was not the absence of rules, but the ability to navigate them while staying true to oneself. One crisp morning, Amina and Jack stood together on the edge of the stream where they had first met. The water flowed clear and steady, reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. Amina took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace she had never known. "I never thought I would feel this way," she said softly, "like I truly belong in my own life." Jack nodded, his expression calm and steady. "You fought for it," he said. "You claimed it yourself, and now it belongs to you." Amina smiled, a quiet, radiant smile that carried both relief and joy. She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but she also knew that she had discovered a strength that would carry her through any difficulty. She had transformed from a girl confined by fear into a woman who had reclaimed her life, who had learned to make choices, and who had inspired others along the way. In the weeks that followed, she began to plan small changes for the future. She wanted to continue her education, to teach and share stories, to nurture the dreams of those around her, and to live a life defined by intention rather than obligation. The village slowly was learning that respect and independence could coexist, that tradition and choice did not need to be enemies. Amina's story, though personal and private, had quietly become a beacon. Young girls and even women in the village began to glimpse the possibilities that had once seemed impossible. They saw that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered in steady, persistent acts of self-respect. And they began to imagine that, like Amina, they too might claim their own lives, one careful choice at a time. With Jack by her side, Amina looked forward to a future that was hers to shape. She had discovered that life was not a matter of being given freedom. It was about taking it, step by step, with patience, courage, and careful determination. The hills, the streams, the sunlit paths of the village, all became part of her story, a story that had begun in fear but had blossomed into hope, resilience, and choice. And in that quiet triumph, Amina finally understood that she had done more than reclaim her life. She had shown that courage, when combined with patience and respect, could transform even the most rigid walls into spaces of possibility. She had discovered that true freedom begins not with rebellion, but with the quiet determination to say, "I choose my own path."